Hi, everybody, and welcome to the second in a series of talks given to you by the Yorkshire Museum in York. My name is Dr. Sarah King. I'm the Curator of Natural Sciences at the Yorkshire Museum, and this is all connected with our amazing summer exhibition, Mary Anning Rocks, which is on until the 20th of September, so please do come along. So, as I said, this is the second of the talks that we've got lined up for you today. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Anjana Khatwa, who is a multi-award winning geoscientist and presenter and an educator. She is passionate about inspiring all those around her, particularly girls, into a scientific career. She's writing a book as well, so look out for that. And she's an EDI consultant as well. So many strings to her bow, and we're very glad that she's given her time to us today. So welcome from wherever you are watching from, either live or in person. So without further ado, I will hand over to Anjana.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hopefully you can hear me okay. Sound is all right. I'm here to really talk to you all about a critical issue in natural heritage, in the geosciences. And hopefully my slide will be up in a minute. There we are. Good. One of the key areas that I work in and have worked in for a long time is really looking at how we can begin to diversify the types of people that we see in the natural environment and within science itself. And for a long time, as a woman of colour, I've worked for about 25 years in protected landscapes in the geosciences, and I have been pretty much a solitary figure in that environment. It's been pretty tough. And over the last 3 or 4 years, probably since the publication of the Glover Landscapes Review in 2019, we've become, or certainly organisations within the natural heritage sector have become more aware of the disparity and inequity of who we see accessing those spaces. And so over the last 3 years, 4 years, I've been working very hard inside the sector, outside the sector, to really raise awareness and try to create institutional change to embrace and welcome audiences who have been historically excluded for a very long time from these spaces. And so that's why my talk is called The Missing. It's all about who is missing from the spaces where we, those of us who are in the club, enjoy and benefit from the knowledge and wisdom that we gain from fossils, from science, from nature. And what I want to do today is really dissect some of the issues that folks have faced and look at some of the problems and the barriers. But ultimately, I want to leave you with a sense of solutions and positivity for the future about what you could do, about what you could ask organisations to do. And I wanted to start off with a little activity first, actually. I put up these categories on this slide. And if you are watching this live, you might want to just put a few names into the comments boxes. I'm wondering if some of you can think of any famous naturalists, astronomers, paleontologists, conservationists, climate change activists, or archaeologists. And I do this activity a fair bit because I work with a lot of natural heritage and cultural organisations to look at equality, diversity and inclusion, which I might sum up in this talk as EDI. So I wonder who comes to mind when you're thinking about people working in these areas. If you have time, please put a comment in the box and I'll be able to respond. But let's kick off because time is obviously quite short. I wonder who you're thinking of when you think of a naturalist. Let's see who comes to mind. Who's a famous person that we know who champions the natural world? And I think most people that I work with, and certainly in my own mind, Sir David Attenborough comes to mind, probably one of the most famous naturalists in the world. What about an astronomer? Now, if you are a history buff, you might be thinking of William Herschel or Galileo. But if you watch TV in the last kind of 10 years, if you kind of bought his books, you may be thinking of this astronomer, this physicist, Brian Cox, Professor Brian Cox. So that might be someone that you might have thought of that came to your mind. What about paleontologists? Now, of course, if you're in the club, if you're in the Earth Sciences Club, you'll be able to reel off a huge number of paleontologists. Thank you, Emily said Chris Packham, and I think Chris Packham, you may be putting him into the category. What about we think of a paleontologist? Hopefully, if you're watching this talk and you know about Mary Anning, you hopefully would say Mary Anning. But when I've run this kind of exercise with non-specialist audiences who are not in the Earth Sciences community, do you know who they say? You won't believe this. They basically say Ross from Friends. And I kid you not, Ross from Friends is probably the most famous paleontologist outside of geoscience community. Ross from Friends. So soak that up, folks. What about an archaeologist? Can you think of a famous archaeologist? So when I've run this activity with, you know, all sorts of folks, non-specialists in the geoscience field and non-specialists in the archaeology field, guess who comes up? Indiana Jones. So there we go. Famous names, famous faces. What about a climate change activist? I'm sure this is on the tip of my tongue. It probably is on the tip of your tongue. But Greta Thunberg comes up as probably the most popular choice for that particular category. And conservationist, you're absolutely right, Emily in the audience, Chris Packham. Chris Packham is probably the most popular name that I get when I run this activity. And I've been running this activity for the last year with probably hundreds and hundreds of people. So this is who we're looking at in terms of whose voices are loudest in the fields of science and nature and geoscience. And what's really shocking is that two of them are completely made up characters. So Ross Geller from Friends and Indiana Jones. But what else do these characters have in common? What else do they have in common? Whose voices are missing that we are not hearing from when we are talking about science and nature? And if we're not hearing their voices, if we're not seeing their faces, how does that influence our understanding of the science and this sector? That's a question I want to pose to you. So it's not just the fact that people and voices are missing from the spaces, the physical spaces of geoscience and nature, but it's also the fact that we as an audience miss out on those really important diverse views that those folks would have and that they would bring to the table. When we don't see the voices and the faces represented, it has a real impact on people coming up into the system. And I wanted to show you some of these figures from a paper that I was lucky to be a co-author on. It was published in Nature Geoscience in 2021. And this paper looked at the racial diversity crisis in the UK geosciences sector. Now, the image on the left, the yellow image, shows us data of the number of young people taking undergraduate degrees in the natural sciences. Geology sits at a recruitment from young people who are from Black and Asian backgrounds. That is at 9.4%. But look at the figures for environmental science and physical geography. If you're Black and Asian, you comprise, if you study physical geography, you are comprising 7.5% of the student body in that period of time between 2014 and 2019. So when we look at that first slide of well, who is? Can you name a famous archaeologist? Can you name a famous paleontologist? If you are Black and Asian and you don't see somebody who reflects who you are, then how on earth can you see yourself becoming part of that sector, becoming part of that field of work when you cannot even recall or you don't understand who might be there already championing the pathway for you? And so this is what this talk is really about. It's really about highlighting the voices that are missing from this sector, from this area that we work in. And I couldn't finish this particular part of the talk without showing you some really amazing people that will diversify this space that we see that is very white dominated, very white male dominated. And here are some amazing people that I encourage you to look up. You have Professor Robin Wall Kimmerer, and she wrote the bestseller, international bestseller called Braiding Sweetgrass. And Professor Kimura is an ecologist. She's a First Nations lady living in North America, and she talks very eloquently about First Nations philosophy and spirituality and that connection with ecological sciences. So that is a great person to follow. Dr. Sheila Kanani is at the Royal Astronomical Society and works there as the head of engagement. Dr. Kanani has recently published a children's book all about astronomy. So she's a great person to know. Professor Christopher Jackson, probably one of the most well-known geologists in the world, in terms of his work on tectonics and particularly salt tectonics. He's a fantastic person to follow because he's always on TV as an expert, but he also presented the Royal Institution lectures about 2 years ago on geology. So a fantastic person to follow. Raksha Dave is actually the president of the Council for British Archaeology. So, you know, what a brilliant reason to follow Raksha Dave. Raksha is also on TV as well. So you'll see her on, particularly I think on programs on Channel 5, archaeology programs. Vanessa Nakate is as famous as Greta Thunberg. She is from Nigeria, I think, but don't quote me on that. And Vanessa has done so much to raise the voices of Africa and how countries in Africa are being impacted by climate change. So Vanessa Nakate, absolutely brilliant to follow in terms of climate change activism. And then, of course, Gillian Burke, who is a presenter on The Watches on the BBC. And Gillian is such an eloquent speaker about her understanding of nature and conservation. And she is also writing a book. So watch out for her book coming out in the future. So some really, really amazing people to diversify your current lens through which you consume nature and science information. Some really great names to know. So how does it feel then to be part of that small minority where, for example, like myself, I've lived in Dorset for almost 20 years. And when you live in a space where you are a minority, when you work in a space where you're a minority, it is a really, really difficult place to exist as a person of colour. And also, I would say for the last 20 years, sometimes I've been the only woman in the room as well. So it's difficult, it's tough. And when you see headlines like this in a paper, this headline was published on February 24th, 2021, and it was, the exact words come from the Lulworth estate. And let me read them out to you because I find them quite shocking and quite offensive. The culturally diverse crowds blamed for seaside litter and vandalism. Now, initially, you might think that that word culturally diverse was something that the newspaper journalists made up to sell the paper. But no, these words were directly taken from a quote from the Lulworth estate in response to the large crowds of people that came to Durdledore and Lulworth Cove when the lockdown restrictions were eased in 2020. And the word culturally diverse, although the Lulworth estate tried to explain that what they meant was not necessarily people of colour, I went onto a live show on BBC Asian Network, and we discussed what this meant for us. And I would say that there were a lot of angry callers on BBC Asian Network, and they were really upset being lumped together and being blamed for the litter and the vandalism that occurred on these beaches. So, no, my slides haven't frozen. I hope you can still see them. I will skip ahead to see that you can see the next slide. Can we see the slide? This shows us how difficult it can be. Oh, the slides are frozen, Sarah. Could you confirm? Or can you see my map? It's okay now. Thank you so much. Now, the reason why people of colour struggle in rural environments is because of these statistics. I live in Dorset, and the current census, this is the current census that's just come out. It tells us that 97% of the population in a rural area like Dorset is white. So if you are a person of colour or you know, of any other kind of ethnically diverse background, and you are coming to a rural space to engage with nature, to walk in nature, you're coming into a space where folks won't necessarily be used to seeing you in the outdoors, on footpaths, on the beaches. And so when we go back to that headline, the culturally diverse are blamed for vandalism and litter, Well, there's two sides to that argument. Number one, have the conservation sector done enough to help those audiences who are new to nature understand how to be in nature, how to act, how to behave, what to expect? And secondly, we can do a far better welcome. There are other ways to try to help audiences that are new to these spaces come and enjoy where they are. But this is the kind of environment that a lot of people of colour are coming into, predominantly white environments, folks that haven't necessarily had the experience of engaging with people from different communities and different cultures. And so therefore there is a lot of suspicion and negativity and fear when, for example, post-lockdown, families were coming from different environments into spaces like this. So yes, it's a tricky balance. It's a very, very tricky balance. And when you are in places like this, places like Lyme Regis or places like up in the Lake District, if you're a person of colour and you're walking through that space, as I have done many, many times, quite often you will experience lots of stares, some comments like, oh, what are you here to do? What are you here for? And quite often I'll be wearing hiking boots or I'll have a rucksack on or we'll be walking, my family and I will be walking. And then you'll wonder, well, I'm wearing hiking boots, I have a rucksack, I'm, looking at the OS map on my phone. I'm here to walk just as you are. And that question, where are you from, is actually seemingly quite an innocent question. And quite often what my response is usually, well, I'm from Dorset. Or, if I'm minded and have a bit more mental energy and strength inside me, I'll often say, well, actually, I moved to Dorset 20 years ago, but I'm actually from Slough. And usually I hope that's when the conversation will end and we'll move on to other things. But sometimes this question then rears its ugly head. Where are you really from? And, when you're, as a person of colour, when you're asked that question, it begins to erode at your sense of identity. It erodes at your confidence and your sense of belonging in that space. Because what does the word really mean? When that word, that supposition is put in front, where are you really from? The question is you are obviously a brown person or a black person. You are in a very white space. We don't normally see people like you here. Why are you really here? And this is probably one of the biggest barriers that people of colour face when they come to natural environments and natural green spaces. And certainly if you're working or studying in a field like geography or geology or environmental sciences, as we saw with that previous statistic, they are incredibly white sectors. So even if you're a student and you fancy studying a degree in environmental sciences, you know that you're going to be one of the very small percentage of Black or Asian students studying that degree. And it wouldn't surprise me if you're asked that question, when you're walking into a lecture or, with someone who you might be sitting next to who's trying to make conversations like, where are you from? I'm from Birmingham. Oh, yeah, but where are you really from? So it's a question that can really, really hurt people of colour because it really kind of questions our sense of belonging and our right to belong in a space. And when we look at how members of the public respond to people of colour in nature, in beautiful places like the Jurassic Coast, these are the kind of comments that I see coming up. And they are offensive. So I have taken out the names of the people that have written them on Twitter. These responses on Twitter were to Dwayne Fields, who is an ambassador for the Scouts. He's an incredibly courageous Black man championing access to nature, particularly for young people in urban spaces. And Dwayne Fields was on Countryfile a few years ago talking about the challenges that he faced as a young person and why he then became an adventurer and an ambassador for the Scouts. And in the programme for Countryfile, he talked about he talked about the Glover Landscapes Review, but he also talked about the challenges that Black and Asian people face in accessing natural spaces. And these were some of the comments that I read on Twitter, and they are very, very offensive. What these people don't quite understand is that deeper sense of reticence that people of colour have. And it's because of this we are questioned whether we have a right to be in nature, that gaslighting our experiences of racism, and really questioning, whether it's all in our own minds, that, and this comment about the fact that Black and Asian people are less likely to be dog lovers as well, that's just a laughable comment there. So these are the kind of comments that we come up against, and they are very, very difficult, and they tend to be very, very exhausting, particularly for people who are championing diverse representation in nature and natural spaces. And I wanted to show you this image, actually. This is such a beautiful image. This is courtesy of Amandeep Nadra, who's done so much work on looking at Indian soldiers in World War II. And I borrowed this image from him. This is an image of Indian soldiers skimming stones in the Dead Sea in 1918. So when you look at that comment from those people about, well, maybe people of colour aren't interested in nature, maybe they just find it boring. It's not the case at all. It's just the fact that people of colour have a very different relationship to nature than other people, particularly white people who have come into it from a different perspective and from a different experience. But ultimately, we are all united in just being in that space. You can see these Indian soldiers skimming stones. So who hasn't skimmed stones on a pond or across the sea? It's something that everybody does. We have a commonality that pulls us together about our love for nature, regardless of race. But in some cases, where people of colour have connected with nature, that has not always been seen in equally as other ways to connect with nature. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. One of the key definitions that we probably need to pick apart here is those words that I used earlier: equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I think it's really important to just define this with a little example. Diversity is certainly, being in the room and kind of being present in that space. So quite often, if you go to different companies, for example, Pepsi Cola, and you have a look at their board, who is sitting on the board, or Natural England, or whoever it might be, whatever organisation it is, go and have a look at who the board members are. Are they diverse? Do they have different people represented who make decisions about the way that organisation functions? Now, they may be diverse in that fact that the staff that work in the organisation might be incredibly diverse, but are their voices being included in how the work is being delivered? And that's the question you have to ask yourself. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Inclusion is all about listening and enabling and empowering the voices to move forward to shape the future of where they are. And I just wanted to give you this example to put some flesh on the bones, if you like. This is a portrait of Elizabeth Bell, Dido Elizabeth Bell, and Lady Elizabeth Murray, painted in 1779. Now, the story here, you may have heard of it because it was made into a film called Belle a couple of years ago, which you can watch on your streaming device of your choice. But Dido is the Black woman on the left, and Elizabeth is on the right. And you can see the way they're portrayed in the painting. There is an exoticism to Dido, isn't there? She's wearing a turban. She's holding like a basket of fruit, if you like. And the way she's pointing at her face, we're not quite sure what this means. My boss at Wessex Museums Trust, Christina Broughton, said, she's an art historian, and she helped me to understand the exoticism in this painting. And she said, absolutely, what the portrait painter is doing is really giving attention to who Dido is as a Black woman. Now, the story is that Dido grew up in the Caribbean, and she had a white father who brought her to England as a 12-year-old. And her father was a merchant seaman, so he ensured that his uncle, who was a High Court judge at the time, he took Dido in, and Dido's father asked his uncle to raise her in kind of alongside her cousin Elizabeth. And for all intents and purposes, they had an equal upbringing. Dido was educated, she was taught to read, she was taught to write. In fact, she wrote beautiful poetry. She even helped her uncle look after all of his legal papers. She was an incredibly valued member of the family and beautifully dressed, as you can see. But all was not as it seems. And I just want to play this little clip for you from the film, and this will give you some idea of what life was like behind the scenes for Dido. Okay, apparently I don't have any sound, so I'm not sure why that is. Let me try that again. If not, I will take you through the reason why I've shown you this clip. So I'm going to try again, but there should be sound because we checked it before, and I am sharing my screen, so we'll try it again, and then if not, we'll move on. Let's try it again from the beginning. And we're frozen. We're not having much luck here, are we? So we're going to move on. In that video clip, which you can see on YouTube, if that's helpful for you, that video clip is quite an emotive clip because what they're talking about, the two women are talking about some people coming over for dinner. And that clip was directly inspired by this diary entry from Francis Hutchinson. And let's read his entry together. A black came in after dinner and sat with the ladies, and after coffee walked with the company in the gardens. The important piece of text to take away is after dinner. So although Dido is beautifully dressed, she was educated, she helped her uncle with all of his kind of legal work, she was still seen as a subordinate. She was still seen as a black woman who was not worthy enough to sit at the table with the rest of the family and their guests. And she would often sit in the kitchen, and there was a real conflict because she was not as low as the servants in the hierarchy of the household, but she was not quite high enough to sit with the family when guests came round. It was a very, very difficult existence for her. And that, to me, is the difference between diversity and inclusion. On the face of it, the portrait shows diversity, but in terms of inclusion, her voice was silent. And when we take a look at who is in the positions to have their voices heard about how nature is managed in the UK, how protected landscapes are managed, like national parks and AUNBs, people of colour aren't in those rooms. And when we look at the statistics, this is from the Glover Landscapes Review, 0.8% of board members at national parks and AUNBs are from ethnic minorities. And it's even worse when we look at who is employed in the sector. 0.6% of the workforce working in environment are from Black and Asian backgrounds. And if you look at farming, it's even worse, it's 0.1%. So when we look at the figures for Black and Asian people moving into degrees like environmental sciences, physical geography, geology, those degrees that would then take them onto careers in the natural environment sector, we have a real disconnect. We don't see our voices represented at the very top where decisions are made. We don't see ourselves represented in the workforce. And so therefore, how on earth can we begin to encourage children and young people into degrees so they can get the qualifications they need to enter spaces where they are looking after nature? So we're in a real situation, like a paradox, really, like a negative feedback loop. Now, when we think about that, because we will come to solutions in a moment, so do bear with me, but we've got to go through this hard stuff first. Why is it we are in this situation where we have such poor recruitment of people of colour into the sector, and particularly to board level? Well, firstly, I've done a lot of work on this in the natural environment sector, but also in museums. And what I found is there's a commonality across cultural and natural heritage sectors. Firstly, that when you talk to folks who are working in those fields, in museums or in national parks or AUNBs, there's a real fear about how to connect with those communities. So, people of colour, Black and Asian communities, there's a fear of how to begin to talk to those communities to find out what they want, So many folks are worried about saying the wrong thing or offending people. And because of that, kind of what's happened over the last couple of decades is those audiences have just been kind of forgotten about. They've been left out and left to their own devices. And I would assume most organizations would just hope they'll fall into the net, come to the site, have a great time, and keep coming back again. But we know from some of the earlier comments on the slides, the culturally diverse, that when we do go into green spaces, there's a lot of suspicion and racism and hostility that those people of color experience. So if the programs that are designed aren't specific to attract those audiences in, if they aren't designed to meet their needs or to speak to what their interests are, those audiences tend not to come to those spaces. So it's a combination of stories that are created at spaces which don't necessarily resonate with audiences, so ethnically diverse audiences, and often there isn't enough of a communication reach to the audiences themselves. So if, for example, you've got a newsletter that goes out or social media and we don't specifically target certain community groups, they'll just never hear about what you have to offer. And then if they do come to those spaces, do they feel welcome? Some people, and especially if you look at organizations like Muslim Hikers or Black Girls Hike, they will tell you that quite often they've been to different places and have experienced microaggressions and racism and Islamophobia. So these are the kind of barriers that diverse audiences are experiencing when they go into those spaces. And then, of course, we come to lack of representation. And we can see this, can't we? Even in that first slide, who can name, how many naturalists do you know that are Black or Asian? So it's that lack of representation with the people that you meet who are at the gate, who's welcoming you at the front of house. If we can't see ourselves represented, do we question if we actually belong? And would we want our children and young people to have careers in that field? So all of these are really great questions to ask, because what we're trying to do is understand the barriers as to why we are not diversifying those spaces. I'm going to try and see if this plays. This is a really wonderful conversation between two people. We've got Kezia and we've got Rianne. And Kezia is otherwise known as City Girl in Nature, and Rianne is the founder of Black Girls Hike. And they had a wonderful conversation, which you can watch the full conversation on YouTube. I'm going to try and play you a part of their conversation from 5 minutes in, 5 minutes, 35 seconds in. And please, if you cannot hear this, give me a heads up, Sarah, and then what I will do is we will ensure that you can see it on YouTube. But I'm going to try and play it for you. If you can't hear the sound, let me know, and then I will kind of tell you, give you a summary of the conversation that Kezia and Rianne have. So I'm going to try and play it for you now. Okay, so what I'm getting is I'm going to stop sharing and then I'm going to reshare my screen again. I hope that's going to be okay. So that's it. So I'm gonna, let me just do the stop share. Oh, I don't know how to stop sharing. Let's have a look. I'm sorry, everybody. Let's just do that. Stop sharing. Right, I'm going to share my screen again and hopefully it's going to work. So entire screen. Let's do that. Share that. I'll just double check, stop, click that button, share tab, audio, entire screen, share system, audio. Let's do that. Hopefully it's going to work. Right, it's going to take a couple of, like a minute or so just for it to come up, so bear with me. There we are. Right, let's see if you can hear the beautiful dulcet tones of these two amazing women, because I cannot speak for them.
It's just, it's growing faster than like a kind of keep.
You say, like, but then the perceptions on like Black girls and them going out in nature and stuff like that.
What would I say the challenges are? I'd say it's definitely that. It's the perceptions. It's kind of like that historic perception that you have of what the outdoors is about. So like most Black people grow up in like inner city environments, don't they? And it just tends to be the thing. And you don't have that much exposure to the outdoors. And it's also, it's not just a race thing, it's a class thing as well, because it's all about the resources. So like certain schools have like Duke of Edinburgh, they're doing like weekenders, conservation weekenders. Certain schools do absolutely nothing. Some schools don't even like go on trips or anything. So I think it's that. And then it's also the fact that then you've not got the skills to actually access the outdoors. You don't really know what you're doing. It's also proximity to nature. How far do you live from decent green places? And I was saying recently that I think that people forget that like when our parents and their generation was coming over, they weren't coming over to be jollying around the British countryside. They were coming over to graft, and they were getting the most hostility in the cities. So why would they then think that, oh, actually, let me just go to the countryside? Have you seen that thing that the National Trust have been doing about the colonial countryside? And basically, I mean, who owns the countryside?
It's not our typical people from our community.
No, it's not. It's not our typical people from our community, unfortunately.
And that's I suppose that's also what it's about as well. Being able, like me, even seeing like someone like you, like it's really inspirational, because I can see myself in that kind of, I have someone to look up to that's actually doing something I believe in. And sometimes it's that as well, being able to see.
I think I'm going to finish it there, because what an extraordinary conversation between these two women. It's going to be my slide on. I wanted to pick up on a couple of things that they talked about, because
someone that looks like you and kind of has the same kind of belief systems and stuff that you can then resonate with you, and it kind of brings that motivation and that kind of drive to also do it.
Right, that's a brilliant one to end on, with Kezia talking about how she's inspired by Rianne, who's the founder of Black Girls Hike. And that goes back to that slide I showed you. It is so important to see yourself represented in powerful voices that are striving forward to change the narrative. So Kezia, in her own words, is saying, I'm so inspired by you, Rianne. It makes me want to do that. And when I showed you those pictures of the naturalists, the conservationists, you know, all of those black faces, those brown faces, women as well, it is so important to see representation, diverse representation, if we want to make that change. And I think that conversation is so powerful. And the other thing that I wanted to pick up for you was that historical legacy of trauma. So, you know, Rianne is absolutely right. When a lot of Black and Asian people moved to the UK, certainly when my parents came here at the end of the 60s, early 70s, they didn't come here to go off for jollies in the countryside. They came here to graft, because they had come from a very difficult situation in East Africa after Kenyan independence, and had come to the UK, and they were real grafters. They were working 7 days a week. And so they were already experiencing the hostility in those urban environments. Why on earth would they then want to go into rural spaces where, you know, you would have had a large majority white population, and then you're putting yourself through that additional trauma? So if you are in an organization that is trying to look at and examine where are the diverse, ethnically diverse people in these spaces, in these green spaces, in these scientific spaces, just bear in mind that there is quite a large historical legacy of trauma that exists that we really have to tackle and unpick. And Rianne mentioned Colonial Countryside, which is this big program run by Corinne Fowler at the University of Leicester in partnership with the National Trust. I do encourage you to go and have a look at that as well. So that's done amazing work in beginning to deconstruct narratives, colonial narratives about the countryside. Here's some positive for you to take away. I've been working with the Open University on a Natural Environment Research Council funded program called Walking the Walk for the last 2 years. And what we have been doing is working with people of colour-led walking groups, including Black Girls Hike. But what we've been doing is empowering and enabling leaders within those groups to take charge of what they would like to know about the landscape. So a couple of academics from the Earth Sciences Department have been working with walk leaders to train them about natural histories of the landscapes they walk over. And now those walk leaders lead fantastic natural history walks for members that come and join them. And the group that's featured here is Dadimas, CIC, which you can find, that's being led by a lady called Dr. Geeta Ludra, who's from the Brunel University. and she's on Instagram, she's on Twitter, and you can look her up as Educating Gita, and her group is called Dadi Mars. And I go to those walks quite often, and they are really inclusive, beautiful, spiritual walks, intergenerational, intercultural, everybody is welcome. But the key thing is we are all connecting through a love for nature and talking about nature. So this is the kind of project that we can begin to foster that begins to explore those connections. I wanted to kind of now touch upon knowledge and knowledge of nature and where that sits. And I wanted to give you this example here. This is a picture of lava flows in Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. And what you can see here are two different types of lava flows. You've got pahoehoe lava flows, which are the kind of runny, ropey lava flows with the ropey structures. And then you've got the kind of crumbly, more brittle lava flows, which are those blocky areas called RR. Okay, so Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, lots of lava, beautiful lava rock. But what I wanted to point you towards was knowledge that indigenous communities in Hawaii had long before geologists started to think about lava itself. Now, this is lava flow in Hawaii, and it's an incredible place. It's Pu'ulaua, and it's a petroglyph site. And I think anthropologists have recorded over 23,000 petroglyphs carved into these lava flows. And what I love about this is that there is a huge distinction in where you find the petroglyphs. The native Hawaiians were choosing to carve these beautiful kind of carvings into pahoehoe lava flows because the surface was a lot smoother and the crust was easy to break through. And yeah, it meant that they could accumulate a lot of petroglyphs in one large area. The other thing that I love about this is the scientific storytelling behind it, because lava flows, volcanoes, are there on the earth because of mantle plumes that are sourced from deep inside the earth, deep underneath the earth's crust, and they're born just on the outer core, these mantle plumes. And as they journey up, as the mantle plume journeys up and it breaks through the earth's crust, it's literally born. The lava, the volcano erupts onto the earth's surface, and that's like a birth of a new rock. Now, what these small cupules, these holes that are drilled into the lava flow signify is a birth of a child. And so into these little cupules, they would have put the umbilical cord of a newborn child. And what that did was it connected that child to the land and the rock forever, for the rest of its life. And I think that beautiful kind of marrying of philosophy and understanding of this rock that was born from the earth, and here is a child that has been born in our community, those two knowledges coming together, that expertise, indigenous expertise and scientific expertise coming together in harmony, that just gives me goosebumps. I just love that story. If we look at other cultures, how have they embodied an understanding of what it means to be connected to nature, connected to earth? Now, I am a Hindu, practicing Hindu, and in my religion, in my faith, we have a word called Dhati, and it comes from the word Mother Earth, Ma Dhati, and it is a word that can be traced back into the Hindu Vedas, the sacred Sanskrit texts, about 4,500 years. What it means, it's a grounding of oneself through the soil, the rock, and the land. And I don't know if such a word exists in English. I don't know if you have a word that can so deeply and spiritually connect you to the place where you are, to the rock that is right under your feet. And Dhati is a very spiritual place to be. It, when you hold a rock in your hand, you can almost feel yourself grounded to the earth. And in the Hindu religion, Mother Earth exists in so many different forms, in so many different incarnations. And this is a very personal picture that I'm showing you. This is a picture of my mother's Hindu temple at home, because Hindus have their own shrines in their homes. And in my mother's temple is this rock. Isn't that amazing? And it is marked by the sacred sindur, the mark to bless it, bless the rock. And inside that rock, my mum has explained to me, is the incarnations of all of these different different incarnations of Mother Earth, Parvati, Dharti, Shitala, Bhundevi, Mother Earth is incarnated into so many different forms, but she is represented by the earth, by the rock. And when people talk about diverse communities, that perhaps we're not connected to nature, that we are divorced from nature, this is all a bit of a fallacy, because we are connected to nature, just in a different way. And when we talk about whose voices are missing, where is that knowledge missing? It takes time, it takes courage to come into this space and talk to these communities to understand what their connection is to nature, because it's very, very different to your own. And of course, if you go all over the world, if you look through history, all sorts of different cultures have had different interpretations of who Mother Earth is, from Gaia in ancient Greece to Pachamama to Haudenosaunee, to Sky Mother, who is the representation of Mother Earth in the Haudenosaunee peoples. So Mother Earth comes in all sorts of different forms, but essentially she represents fertility and rebirth and regeneration in pretty much all of these different cultures. So it's fascinating to know that the expertise and the understanding and the value of Mother Earth crosses time, it crosses space, and it crosses cultures. And if you go to Australia and you are lucky enough to visit Uluru, this is an incredibly sacred site. And in the culture of the Aboriginal people, in the Anangu people, there is a law called Jukalpa. And this law is just like the Hindu law of Dharti. It is a law that defines how people live in harmony with nature, how we care for our grandfathers and our grandmothers, because in Aboriginal culture, every part of nature is like a relative. Uluru is like a grandfather. And so the Aboriginal people live in the philosophical sense that they are there to care and nurture the land. And these ancient philosophies, we have much to learn from them. And one book that I really love that begins to talk about this is Braiding Sweetgrass. I mentioned Robin Wall-Kimmerer earlier. And in her book, she talks about First Nations philosophy on nature. And she's part of the Potawatomi. And she talks about how her people kind of view nature. And I wanted to put that word in yellow, animate. In the Potawatomi, rocks are animate, as are mountains and water and fire and places. All of these spaces in nature are imbued with spirit, and they are all animate, okay? And I think what we need to do for those in the sector that would like to work with diverse communities is to begin to reframe how you look at nature away from this kind of static environment, particularly rocks, because rocks don't necessarily move and they don't make sounds, and they don't have these kind of really bright feathers or, you know, smells like flowers do, but they are still animate in their own way, particularly with their deep earth stories. And I think this philosophy, this is a really useful way to begin to think and how to reframe, particularly what we are talking about, decolonizing geosciences and earth sciences, and beginning to step into a space where we are listening to the voices who are missing. And when Professor Kimmerer talks about the animacy of science, it kind of sits in contrast with colonial histories in natural history. So let's look at Henry de la Beach. He owned a slave plantation. Although he was a huge supporter of Mary Anning, he did support her through his funds raised through a slave plantation in Jamaica. So how do we feel about that? It's quite a controversial feeling, isn't it? I found that really difficult to deal with when I discovered this through Tom Sharp's work. And look at these bird skins collected by Alfred Russel Wallace. Although collecting the bird skins helped Wallace to co-develop the theory of natural selection, he had to kill thousands of birds in order to achieve that knowledge. So when we talk about the progression of science and scientific knowledge and what's missing, is there another way was there another way to have worked with Indigenous communities to appreciate their understanding and their expertise? And because it wasn't at the time, because of colonization, at what cost was this knowledge made and contributed to where we are today in terms of natural history and natural sciences? And this leads me on to kind of touching upon that point that Rianne made. what about these beautiful spaces that we want people to go to, that we want communities of all backgrounds to go to? And this is Petworth House in Sussex, and I went there, and it is absolutely stunning. It's owned by the National Trust, beautiful deer park. Look at the ancient nature of the trees. And I was walking around and I was just thinking to myself, this is absolutely idyllic. But in the deepest, darkest part of my heart, I knew why this place had such great beauty, it had such opulence. And this is why. And if you walk through the art galleries at Petworth House, you'll see this painting. This is Charles Seymour. And this is words that I've taken from the National Trust website. He's painted with his dog and an unidentified child attendant, who is this young black boy holding a tray, a salver. And it's a really disturbing image. I'm not going to lie, after I had this beautiful walk through the deer park and I went into the house and I saw this picture, I was really traumatized, because the look of, if you have a chance to see the portrait close up, you can see how the portrait painter has mirrored the eyes of the dog looking up at his master to the eyes of the boy looking up to his master. We can't be for sure that this boy is his slave, but if we are using our intelligence about the slave trade and about all of the timings of the slave trade, it would be an educated guess to say that this young unidentified child attendant was a slave. And so this is a very disturbing aspect, particularly for people of colour who want to come into natural spaces. So when we talk about barriers, yes, historical trauma, the legacies of that is a barrier. There's a really great book that I can recommend if you would like to read it. It's Amitav Ghosh, and it's Nutmeg's Curse. And I think this is a really powerful book. I've probably read the first couple of chapters because it is a difficult read. And the nutmeg especially has a very, very traumatic colonial history. It was fought over the land. Banda Aceh in Southeast Asia was fought over by British and Dutch forces who wanted to own those nutmeg plantations and subjected the indigenous communities to such horrors. And I think off this, we can begin to decolonize and deconstruct how we are where we are today in terms of natural sciences. And this wonderful quote from Alexandre Antonelli, Professor Antonelli at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kew. This was a statement he made just after Black Lives Matter. And he's talking about very much what's in the nutmeg's curses, is that new species are discovered every year, by scientists. It's like this new knowledge. But actually, what he's saying is that that knowledge has existed in indigenous communities for thousands of years. And yet, at the time during the 18th, 19th centuries, when slavery was so widespread, that knowledge was ridiculed, it was almost wiped out. So there is a long history that we have to try and, address. We have to try to really grapple it with both hands and address it and recognize it and begin to understand, where does indigenous and cultural and spiritual knowledge that comes from these communities, how can we now harmonize it with all of the knowledge that we have gained over the last 2 centuries. And I wanted to bring this up, and this is controversial. There is this book called Wilding, and I've put this quote in from Chris Packham. It's a poignant and practical moving story of how to fix our broken land. So he's writing about wilding. And I thought these words were interesting. This should be conservation salvation. It is a new hope, okay? And if you've read Wilding, if I was going to give you the quick summary, it is about Isabella Tree, whose family owns the Knepp estate in Sussex, and it's all about how the family decide to let nature take its course, because the land has been, heavily affected by, overproduction in terms of agriculture and farming. And so what they do is they try lots of different methodologies out to try to let nature take its course. If they let nature take its course, what will happen to the land? That's essentially what the book is about. But this whole idea of working in harmony with nature and intercropping plants, for example, that benefit the soil, that benefit wildlife, this is nothing new. So when we talk about this is a new hope, that is very much through a global north lens. If we look at what First Nations people are saying in response to this kind of new trend to wilding, if you like, what people like Ade Romero Briones is saying from the First Nations Development Institute, she's saying we've got to decolonize this approach, because we have to think before European settlement and contact to a time when folks like from her communities were living more in balance with the ecological environments that we're trying to correct now. So I think when we look at books like Wilding, we should also be looking at books and narratives and talks and conversations being held by communities where Ade Romero Briones is from. It's really, really important we recognize the roots of the knowledge that we currently ascribe as groundbreaking and new to the global north, because quite often they come from another source. And I wanted to kind of begin to close up really, and I wanted to give you this I wanted to give you, like, with a take-home message, a real positive message about Dharma. And Dharma comes from Dharti, Ma Dharti. And Dharma is a principle that exists within Hinduism. You may have heard of it. And it has existed since 4,600 years ago. And where Wilding talks about restoring Nep back to nature and kind of really looking at how we balance the needs of human with the needs of nature. Well, actually, Wilding is the new global north term for Dharma, and Dharma is a word that has existed for 4,500 years. What it means is maintaining our relationship with nature through balance. And that is understanding nature, how we function, how we live with it, how it benefits us, how can we benefit nature? It's all about that give and take relationship we have with the natural world around us. And that word Dharma, Chris Packham doesn't use it, but it's not new. It's 4,500 years old. Wilding is the global north interpretation of Dharma, of Jukarpa, of so many other belief systems that have existed in different global communities across the world. And to give you an idea of where Dharma comes from, let me tell you a story, because Dharma is an ancient story that gives you an idea of where the principles of balance in nature comes from. So the story of Dharma is as follows. Ma Dharti, so this is Mother Earth, was flourishing. She was providing humanity with all the gifts that they needed to survive. Plants, crops, water, rain, animals, fruit, vegetables. And there was a king, and he's pictured here actually in the corner. There was a king who was absolutely greedy. He was so greedy, he did not give any consideration as to how many resources he was using from Mother Earth. And Mother Earth, Dharti, was getting incredibly upset. And she asked this king, she said to him, you need to be careful, because you are using all of my resources without a care or without any consideration for the future. You do not care about me. And the king his response was incredibly callous. He said, well, I'm here to use you. Your resources are for my benefit only and my subjects. And we will use your resources as much as we want. So thank you very much, but we have our own agenda to play. And Mother Earth, Ma Dharti, became incredibly upset. And she felt so violated and so used that she turned herself into a cow and she ran off and she ran away and she hid and she took all of her gifts of nature with her. And what happened to this evil king and his kingdom was that the kingdom suffered immensely. There was pestilence and disease, and there was lack of food and famine, and everybody suffered. All of humanity suffered. And the wise sages in the kingdom came to see the king, and they said, why has this happened? What is happening to all of our people? And the king said, well, she came to see me, Mother Earth, and I told her that, we were here to use as much as we wanted, and I was right. And the wise sages said, oh, king, that was a very bad thing to do. You need to go and apologize. And he said, there's absolutely no way I'm going to apologize. I've done nothing wrong. And so the wise sages were very cross with him. And so they struck him down and killed him. That sounds very brutal. But what happened next was they did some kind of celestial kind of mantras over his body, and they drew out his evil spirit and cast it away as a demon. And then out of his other side of his body, they drew out his true true benevolent spirit, his good spirit. And this was the new king called Prithvi. And as this new king took form, his celestial form, the wise sages said to him, now it's your job to go and find Mother Earth, Ma Dharti, and to beg her forgiveness, to come back and restore Earth to what it was. And so King Prithvi goes on an adventure and he finds the cow, the sacred cow, and he chases her. And his initial reaction is to capture her and to force her into submission, to give her gifts back to humanity. But she runs away and she hides and she keeps hiding. And it is only when she basically tells him, you have got to change your way of thinking about Earth. You have got to promise to look after me. You have got to promise to set down a series of laws that means that I will be treated with respect and that all of my resources will be used in a way that is not to your own benefit or your own gain. And once the king and Mother Earth agree on these principles, on these laws, which are called dharma, then Mother Earth is restored and humanity's position with nature, alongside nature, is restored. And I find that to be such a beautiful, powerful story about learning from cultures, global cultures and global stories. And, you know, we talked about Wildling, and it is a fantastic effort. It's a beautiful book, but it comes from philosophies that have existed thousands and thousands of years ago. Dharma, the story of Dharma that most Hindus have grown up knowing about Ma Dharti. We've known this all our lives, to live in harmony with nature and to listen to the gifts that she gives us. And I just want to finish with this, in that we are all experts in our own right. We have our own stories to bring to the group, whether you are part of a walking group like Dadimas in the Chilterns, or whether you're like me, a 12-year-old girl that walked across a lava flow that made it her life's mission to become a geologist. We all have a role to play in looking after nature. We all have our own expertise that can be respected and be brought into the conversation. And this is some of the work that I do with the museums, at Wessex Museums that I work in, and a really interesting way of beginning to model how to work equitably, empathetically, with trust, with different types of communities. So I'm just going to leave you with that. And I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening to my talk. It's been an absolute joy to share some of these ideas with you. And a lot of the ideas will be coming out in my forthcoming book, The Whispers of Rock, published by Little Brown in the UK, coming in September 2025. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Anjana. Wow, thank you so much. Oh no, we've got an echo. I think we're okay. That was such a lot of information, so much to think about there, and thank you for the sort of the personal things that you shared as well. I think it's actually really sort of brought home how everything is so connected. I mean, I'm apologies. I think I spoke over you slightly at the start because I was trying to say, I'd forgotten to say, please put any questions and comments in the comments boxes on the YouTube and Facebook channels. But the sort of, I mean, as museums, we're always sort of trying to come up with the next big exhibition and how to sort of share our collections and how to get the stories out there. But actually, we're sort of, I mean, me coming from a sort of a scientific background, I'm sort of looking at the science and, you know, how to get this, the principles and the sort of more scientific, maybe harder to sort of get across principles, but actually it's about turning it on its head, isn't it? It sort of resonated with me when you were sort of pulling in all the cultural links. Actually, we're all being sort of, you know, all globally being dragged that way because of climate change, right? Yes. You've been talking about this connection that everybody has, however much they're in tune with it, to the world and to what's going on around them and to their environment. And actually, we're all being shown that in good and bad ways, and a lot of people are being affected really badly by it, and it's not necessarily their fault. And actually, that kind of I'm not being very articulate, but that was just sort of things that sort of resonated with me, that actually you can't, you know, it's there, isn't it? You're obviously very aware of that connection, and we're all being shown that in quite sort of black and white terms quite often these days, and increasingly.
Yes, Sarah, and I think that story of Madhavti, where has the laws, Dharma, that story of Dharma and that story of Mother Earth being ravaged and used and abused and then running away, and then humanity having to go to her and say, we're really sorry we've done this. We need to come to some kind of agreement where we can exist in harmony. I mean, that was written 4,500 years ago. I mean, I get goosebumps because I kind of think, this is what every single, global meeting about climate change is about, isn't it? About bringing together all of those voices together to agree on an international treaty that helps everybody, particularly those in the global north who are emitting the greatest carbon emissions, understand that they need to scale back emissions in order to respect what is happening to the earth. It's incredible, isn't it? 4,500 years ago that was written, and yet here we are, and we are facing this diabolical situation that was preventable. Sorry, I could get quite, but it's the whole book that I'm writing is looking back on some of those philosophies and those understandings and big. It's not saying the science is not saying science is wrong, or we need to put that aside. But I think what has been put aside is that knowledge from communities for so long, which was ridiculed, and now what we need to do is bring it out into the mainframe and see how it sits alongside and educates us in the scientific sector.
Yeah, so what to think about. There always seems to be like a little bit of echoing there. But you're at the forefront of it. I mean, I thank you for your work. It can't always be easy to sort of be telling these stories. Obviously, some people aren't very receptive to them, and as you've demonstrated, there's a lot of very ignorant people, a lot of biases around in, certainly on social media, but obviously in everyday life as well. So yes, thank you so much for doing everything that you do, I guess. It seems almost sort of quite reductionist, really, to sort of, I was going to sort of ask you a little bit, I should have mentioned at the start that you're a patron of the Mary Anning Rocks charity, who I should have said our Mary Anning Rocks exhibition, which features the maquette little statuette that was made before a full-size statue of Mary Anning was raised in Dorset last year, the incredible paleontologist. But Anjana's a patron of that charity, so I was just going to sort of ask how your reflections on sort of her as a woman in science and the sort of barriers that she faced, and how we can maybe sort of think of her today as a sort of an inspirational figure, and sort of how we can learn from her story, if you like.
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think Mary Anning she literally is a monolith now, because there's a statue there, isn't she? Isn't there? But she isn't a monolith in a way, because there is a Mary Anning, whether it's a young boy or a young girl in Clapham or in Lyme Regis, there are children from working class backgrounds that still experience what she was experiencing 200 years ago. Lack of food, lack of funds, lack of access to decent education, losing family members, because obviously Mary lost her father when she was 12 years old. And Mary's story is one that is so relevant for today. And so when we think about her story, this is not a figment of the past. This is actually happening now. And I meet plenty of children and young people when I do my, 2 monthly free school talks, and I meet these children, young people, and I see it in their eyes, and they are absolutely fascinated by natural history and the stories that rocks and fossils can tell us. And so what Mary's story does is it gives us hope and understanding of how to work with children and young people from those backgrounds. How do we support them? How do we nurture their passion? How can we give them space to thrive and to grow so they can enter this space, whatever it might be? They might want to be a doctor, they might want to be a paleontologist, I have no idea, but there is a spark in every single child. And I think what Mary stands for is, particularly for women in science and for someone like myself, is resilience. And she, at the time, when we talked about who is the expert in the room, she was never seen as the expert until much later on, when she was appearing, you know, people, the learned society started to say, actually, what you're writing does make sense. I mean, that is true. That plesiosaur that you described is a genuine thing, because Cuvier at the time, do you remember? He said that wasn't. Yeah. That's not real. I think you made that up. And then it was like, oh yeah, it is real. God damn it. So, you know, even she was questioned at the time, like, are you really an expert because you're a woman and you're working class and you haven't really got an education? And I think when we look at today, I've been in those situations where I've been overlooked. Like, we're not going to promote you because you know, this other person is far more qualified. And I thought to myself, what qualifies him then? What actually qualifies that? And, you know, a lot of the time there is an assumption made, whether you're a woman or a woman of color or you're disabled or you're LGBTQ+, there are a lot of barriers that still exist for people wanting to progress in science or nature, particularly those fields. And it is tough. But what Mary's story shows us is we can do it with our allies. And I know I mentioned Henry de la Beach and the way he funded Mary, but she was successful because she had a very strong team of allies around her. And I think that's what we can take away as women in science, as people of color in science and nature, is build your allyships, build your communities, and they will support you through those very difficult times. And they'll also hold you up and celebrate you when you need celebrating.
Fantastic. Oh, just get past the echo. Such wise words. Thank you so much. I'm not seeing any questions come in on our channels that we're going out on at the moment. So as time's marching on, we might leave it there. But thank you so much again, Anjana, for your wisdom, your knowledge, expertise, and your insights as well, because I think there's just so much to learn there, and so much for all of us to learn. Certainly at the Yorkshire Museum, we've got a long way to go, and we're just making baby steps. So we'll start trying to think in different ways in the future. Of course, I can't leave without plugging the exhibition yet again. It's our summer exhibition, so it's on now until the 20th September. So lots for all the family to do, and you can meet Mary Anning herself on Fridays and Saturdays during the school holidays. And we have 2 more talks coming up in this series. So the next one is on the 7th of September with Dr. Liam Herringshaw talking about why Mary Anning would have loved the Yorkshire coast. So do come along to that one. This talk will be available to watch again on our York Museums Trust YouTube channel. And for any information about anything else, check our social media channels or yorkshiremuseum.org.uk. So thank you very much. Thanks, Anjana, and thank you everyone for joining us. Bye for now.